Hi. My name is Winnie Song. I'm an independent game maker in in New York, sorry. I graduated last year from NYU Game Center with an MFA in game design, where Franciscus came from. And now I also teach visual design at NYU. So content warning, obviously there is violence in this talk, images of video game blood and guts, and GIFs. So if you have any problems with those, please, you are free to leave. So this is my game BADBLOOD. It was my thesis during my MFA. It's a local split-screen hide-and-seek between two players with a deadly consequence. I'll show you the trailer. So with my thesis, I was interested in a game world in which people could actually, fear each other and be kind of deathly afraid of what would happen if they were to make the wrong move at the wrong time. So I decided to work on this kind of violent stealth game for two. So I wanted to make a game that allowed players to kind of explore this feeling and intent of hunting somebody, outsmarting another person, and to do things kind of quickly and carefully. I was also really interested in this intimate kind of human violence about how would you trick another human being, this infinitely unique and inconsistent other person? How would you kind of manipulate them? So I decided to kind of make this one-hit kill game, so kind of a slow game in which you kind of have to draw out the aggression in the other person. I want to make a game that's simple but difficult to master, but could be won by anyone if they're kind of careful and aware and never underestimate their opponent. So every round of BADBLOOD is unique because every player is unique. It's unpredictable. When we're faced with our own vulnerability, it kind of demands us to use our sort of primal animal instincts. And at the end of every round of this game, there are these kind of graphic kill screens that kind of detail the murder in full. So naturally, a couple times during development, I got asked, but why does it have to be so violent? And this is the main question behind this talk. Let me explain. I think this question stems not from the excess of violence in games, but mostly because the game's employment of violence is not convincing to us. So when we think about violence, what violence is doing in our games, what generally comes to mind is this. And it's easy to kind of question the necessity of this. It's easy to kind of wonder, well, does this game really need this much blood in it? Or do I really need to shoot the guy in the head 10 times to get this high-end gear? Can the job be done without this? But it's also easy to kind of say, leave off. If you don't enjoy it, play something else. And this is because I think, the subject of violence in video games is the easiest kind of fence to jump. You're either into it or you're not, move on. But why are we into it? Or why are we against it? Despite our sort of very natural and obvious repulsion to violence, the majority of video games are actually built on the foundation of it. So whether it is the beating or the caging or the killing or some other form of eradication of another. And the thing is, as far as violent games go, BADBLOOD is not particularly bloody. It's certainly not realistic in its bloodiness, but something about it makes kind of players wins. And even those with iron stomachs, these friends of mine who play very, very violent games, devolve into kind of yelps and they kind of struggle to outlive each other. And they run in opposite directions and returning to sort of more like a playground mindset. And often people kind of recoil of what they've done in the game. And I think this is because what violence is actually doing in our games is this. So if you remember this game, it was on Windows 95. You're a mouse and you push these kind of blocks around and your objective is to not get eaten by the cat. And it's a simple game. But as a child of 5 or 6, this was a very traumatic experience for me. I remember very clearly my sort of deathly fear of this cat who was this terrifying force. ever moving towards you and able to kind of travel diagonally through blocks. And the kind of sheer panic I felt as the potential for violence drew near was palpable. But something I failed to kind of realize at the time, because I was young, was that the player is actually also an aggressor, and one with more advantages than the cat. So I'm able to kind of manipulate the environment and cage the cats into this one-by-one box and turn them into cheese. The thing is, the violence in this game is very low res. It's not a realistic simulation. There's no blood or sort of squeaks of horror, but the effect is true. Even today, when I look at it after sort of years of playing first-person shooters and parkouring over bodies, I'm on edge just looking at this. And I was kind of really interested in that reaction. And what I found was that the basis on which kind of players find investment in ultimately sort of simple systems was this visceral fear of violence as the mobilizing factor. So this fear of the other and the intolerance of them and their intolerance of me, and fear of that kind of space between us shrinking and the proximity of that intolerance. And in this fear, the player kind of behavior shifts. They no longer are this kind of the rational, clear-thinking, detached agent who's planning their course carefully. They become something a bit more animal. And at its best, even just the threat of violence can change the way we behave in the game. Player forgets about the controller, the machinery they are playing on, the systems at work. They're more busy kind of reacting to the fight or flight mechanism that's in us, the kind of biological primal instincts as this other rears its head. And I think this is the true effect of violence in video games, this ability to kind of convince the player completely of the game's facade and charade and its constraints, and to have players kind of pick up a very complex and often incomprehensive mechanics of the game, its clunky controller, these layers of systems and graphics, and then have them react like they were born into it. And living with violent games have made me kind of understand myself better and how my mind kind of works to, keep itself alive. My favorite games have been the ones that kind of ridicule this idea that I have any control over my own instincts, over my own biological, triggers, that I can act rationally sort of in sort of high-tension situations. I live for the games that say, no, this is what you are. And what we are is violent. We are violent creatures. It's in our nature. We think about it every single day. Once cornered, I think, even a mouse bites. And I think, every one of us, the kindest, most well-meaning of us, once faced with danger or threat, will do something. And that's neither good or bad, I think, just how we are wired. Aggressive behavior is human behavior. Violent games are a product of that, not the source. But the thing about a lot of the violent video games that I've played and loved is that they're not really about violence. They have violence in them, but violence isn't the focus. I think they could all kind of live on this list, this very short list of nonviolent games. Because they're often sometimes more about exercises in tact, in moderation or precision. They test my memory or spatial cognition or my ability to kind of manipulate the system for my advantage. The act of violence is often downplayed. It's a kind of a second thought. They feel like dart games, wearing this mask of brutal carnage. I'm shown these very incredibly graphic images of my, bullet, shattering this guy's skull, and it's cool and everything. But there isn't that sort of visceral reaction that I have as the mouse in The Rodent's Revenge. These guys are kind of nothing compared to those cats that I'm kind of churning into cheese. And I think it's because it's difficult to feel the risk in these systems. These acts of violence feel like wrestling with a rule book. I am more often affected by things like chess. If I'm checkmated, I feel like a bit more of a sort of reaction to that. There are games about the consequences of violence. They're to kind of prevent the alleviation of them and the lack of awareness and empathy for my victims, which is also known to perpetuate violent behavior in me. And I found that kind of weird, because why punish the players for violence that is hard-coded? The player is also a passive victim of that. I only did what the game empowered me to do. There are games about killing zombies and aliens with friends. Switching out the humans and blood for oil so we can make kind of violence a bit more consumable, easier to swallow. And we get this kind of desired result of, the carnage without having to sort of suffer the unpleasant side of it, which is like things like guilt, fear again, a real regard for the subject of our violence. And we are told that this is okay because, they're not alive. It desensitizes us to the sight of our own massacre, of blood and blown off heads. And this act of sort of making the object of our violence distant or faceless, accentuate their otherness, make them brainless or heartless, or making the act itself feel less graphic, or with alternatives to bullet and flesh with other things. It's a game saying, it's fine, it's not real, over and over, and I should feel patronized, but I'm not even that, because I care so little about the acts of violence I'm performing. I don't even need to take the effort to, distinguish itself from reality. And I feel like the violence here can be the narrator of what, that we as players are capable of doing, and what can be done unto us. And even the games that are about violence spend a lot of time making excuses for it, and a lot of time making sure we don't really feel like we're being aggressive. And I don't understand the video game's sort of self-consciousness about its own themes, about its own MO. When I was working on BADBLOOD, I wanted to heighten the game's consciousness about its own mechanics. I wanted players to kind of confront their own violence as they're kind of working on them, kind of force reflection on that. So during development, I watched a lot of nature shows, a lot of David Attenborough crooning the ways of the kind of natural world, where the kind of act of violence is held with the same necessity as things like living and breathing and playing and resting and caring for family. I rewatched a lot of Tarantino movies, samurai comics, TV shows like Vikings, where violence is both the sort of foundation of how society is built and also the show's main aesthetic. Biblically, the first murder to have ever been performed by a human was fraternal. It was a very determined, thoughtful act of one brother who was scorned by his father's favoritism, killing the other. Murder existed in media as long as media existed, for as long as there were sort of people on Earth. Violence is as much a capacity in us as empathy is, or as hunger is. So I feel like it's really unnecessary for video games to compensate for its excess. And the part of the things that I worked on in BADBLOOD is to make the game's main protagonist and narrator this visceral, extravagant sort of human violence. Because I felt that humans, as well as passionate, and violent, are also vulnerable. And I want to inspire that in sort of appropriate behavior from people. I wanted to kind of represent the player as someone who is equally vulnerable and equally afflicted by the system as their opponent. Here is someone who wants to live as much as you do. And the murder in BADBLOOD had to feel deliberate, like the way these two brothers kind of went out to a field. To make a successful kill, most of the time the player had to kind of plan, to read their opponent's movement. And most importantly, they had to be close. Every death is kind of intimate in BADBLOOD. You have to be so close you can almost smell it. And every execution is a millisecond away from your own death. And once the kill was made, the event had to take up the whole screen. It had to be kind of visually obstructive of space, of time. It had to kind of affect the murderer as much as it affected the victim. So what the actual role of the violent game is much more than just making violence okay or fun, but actually to make it louder, to emphasize the essence of it, to make it the main event, to make us feel and understand the full experience, and to make it sort of unignorable. The role of violent video games is to try and sensitize us to how these acts make us feel. Embracing violence in gameplay will socialize and civilize, as well as kind of allow for exploration of a fundamental wiring in our biology. And the game doesn't have to be explicit in its violence to be really present. The absence of violence or the potential for blood to spill is often more affecting. And because the problem with violence in video games is not the sort of excess of it, it's the apology. And when I first started making games, I had these kind of grand ideas of what games should be able to do, building huge worlds and having these fantastical journeys. But it doesn't come close to how games are capable of making me feel, empathy or make my heart clench at like a 10-frame animation. Violence inside is a very physiological reaction in us, and that's very real. So how do we come to terms with our own violence? How do we kind of see through? It's hard because, violence is very personal. It touches us in a way that no other, nothing else can. It changes our lives and affects our sort of perception irretrievably. The thing is, we live in an era where violence is a big taboo. There is a sort of high focus on sensitivity on subjective violence, which has a kind of clear, identifiable agent, a monster of some sort, acts of terrorism, domestic violence, school shootings, hand in hand with these sort of brutal forms of objective and social violence, that's kind of inherent in the structures of our society. Police shootings, brutality, war, and then also the systemic violence, kind of endemic to our socioeconomic order. The act of violence against another is despicable. It's weak. I'm allowed to make a game about killing your friends and also believe that killing is bad. I think the hypocrisy of a video game being violent while not advocating for violence in real life is kind of a boring one to discuss. I think what's more interesting is maybe the ethical illusion of our sympathy to the suffering and pain that is witnessed directly, and through someone with a visibly rich, personal, meaningful life. The fallacy that the button to kill someone right in front of you is much more repulsive than pressing a button that will destroy a city. So how can we talk with objectivity about an act so personal and unforgivable as violence, without, in a sense, kind of participating in its horror? Great news, we do it all the time. Video games are the only medium where we can explore this inherent part of our biology with very little context, and just the space and the time to figure it out. We talk about every other part of nature through this medium. We test our greed and gluttony, lust, pride. We exercise all our vices through these mechanics. Our brilliance and thoughtlessness and our sociability, our prejudices, our violence and our empathy. So instead of kind of simulating the full context of the act, we can just simulate the essence, the feeling, the result of our actions. In this case, of violence, the awareness of our own vulnerability and the susceptibility to violence, both as a perpetrator of it and as a victim. And violence in games can be very intimate and revelatory. It can inspire incredibly thoughtful, careful gameplay. It can showcase great focus, self-reflection, genius empathy. It amplifies a sort of physical and mental coherence between opponents. And I actually believe violence is where the concept of the other breaks. That kind of final strike that takes the virtual life, of something is the moment we understand, and appreciate the intelligence and the vulnerability of the opponent and ourselves. And that is the point of violence in games, I think, if one has to ask. It kind of turns play into performance. And BADBLOOD is a detachment of violence from its politics. Violence for violence's sake, pure violence, or something. What I wanted is the grounds in which players can be just purely and only their ability to function under the threat of violence from the other. And it's kind of impossible to explore that violence in us without these other things. The politics of fear and power, things that kind of make it fucked up to kind of indulge in this violence. It's difficult to kind of look at. But I think instead of sort of celebrating and advocating for the non-violence of video games, we should consider the language violence provides us to kind of articulate what makes us, us. What violence can say about ourselves, both as human beings that are now, that we've established, violent by nature, and also as players who are smart enough to distinguish what precise part of violence that gives us catharsis. And I think games are the perfect medium to exercise these parts of us that we don't think about or have the objectivity to look at straight on. They provide an interactive context, which is, where we can exercise, these acts that make us feel things like, the threat or, regret, things like guilt. Through play, we can kind of purge that part of us that revel in the sort of outwitting or the hunt or the stealth or the killing. BADBLOOD has to be violent because that's what the game is about. I wanted to make a game about, hiding and seeking and manipulating, tricking the other person to believe you're one place when you're really in another. And that kind of requires intent and bloody-mindedness that could only be performed by a human with as much to lose as another one. And what I'm trying to say is not necessarily that we should make more violent games, but to make games and to play games in order to learn more about ourselves. The way makers and lovers of all art forms do. I didn't intend to make a violent game with BADBLOOD, but I intended to create sort of a playable treatise of human nature. So I want to ask questions like, what do I believe the human beings behind the controller are made up of? What do I want to say about them? How will they act in the situation? Will they choose their own safety over the killing of their opponent? Will they hide or will they fight? And what is it about the world that I live in that I want to kind of figure out? Violence in video games can be a sort of language of the viscera, and it's kind of worth more than a question of its necessity. It deserves a question that's not, truistic and dismissive. It doesn't deserve measure by the amount of red on the screen. It deserves questions like, how are we representing this violence? Or who is performing it? Who is the victim? Is it physical, psychological? For how long does the violence last? What part of the body is inflicted? Is it gonna scar? Will it bruise? From what angle is the violence seen? And our reaction to violence kind of fascinates me. The response to violence with violence is also perfectly kind of irrational. Despite our bodies being kind of thoroughly wired with these kind of fight or flight instincts to avoid violence as well as possible, the fact that it kind of is ever present and it dictates almost all of our biological responses and is prevalent in all aspects of, social and cultural kind of scene is amazing and human. I believe that only once we accept our own biology and embrace this nature, unchanged in philosophy from 10,000 years ago, I believe then art is very possible. Thank you.